Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be around the city, across the state, coming to you live from the heart of Chicago. This is e-learning with Mr. Moeller, and so today we're going to talk about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, how it relates to our discussion of federalism, and some other key topics. So, as you guys should remember from last year, the Articles of Confederation is the wartime government, the first government that the United States of America ever had. It was the government that led the states through the Revolution, and under this government, states were more powerful than the central government they created. The idea of kind of the United States was literally states uniting to fight against Great Britain. They viewed it like ancient Greece, where the Greek city-states would come together to fight the Persians. And so under the Articles of Confederation, there were no real federal government powers. It's pretty much just existed to keep this alliance together during the war. This government could not collect taxes, could not force states to follow laws, and so ultimately you're looking at a government that really doesn't have a lot to do. Not that it did not have a lot that it could have done. The Articles of Confederation really had some detriments that caused it to fail. The first is that tax thing. During the Revolutionary War, when the states are fighting for independence against Great Britain, this government could not tax the states, tax the citizens to raise money in order to pay for it. So what you end up getting is a situation where you have a government being begged by George Washington for money to fight their war. This also kind of spilled over into foreign policy. The 13 original states would each make different treaty agreements, or they would just simply refuse to follow the treaties that the United States had signed. Best example of this was a treaty they signed with Great Britain. States had to pay back debts, and they just refused to. And so that was a really, really big problem. And so as some of these states stopped paying back their debts or did not pay them back, people just said, all of the United States, you can't trust them, don't lend them money. This is a time where America is trying to expand west. New states potentially being created, and so you need some sort of central government to create new states. And then kind of what a lot of historians call kind of the last straw here was Shays' Rebellion. It was a rebellion. There's a really great story of it. You can look it up. But essentially, there was unrest in the streets, an armed uprising against the United States, and the national government did nothing. It had no power to intervene to even ensure the existence of the new United States. And so a lot of people at this time felt a change needed to happen. And so a couple of kind of prominent people, among them James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, they decide to gather together the leaders of the states and come up with a new government that could actually address and solve some of these problems. So when we talk about conflicts over this government, there's a lot, and a lot of these are actually still around today, some of them aren't. The biggest fight in this Constitution, which I would argue still today is the idea of states versus federal government. Would the states, by creating the national government, give up all their power and control? We still argue over these issues today. Everything from gun laws to marijuana legalization, we have kind of these fights between states and federal government. Second large issue was slavery. If you're founding a country in which all men are created equal and you're talking about potentially adding a Bill of Rights, slavery seems a weird thing to have. It's very, very big business in this time, especially in the South. It's legal in most states. And so those that want to abolish slavery, they're going to meet a lot of resistance from people that want to keep it the way it is. Another main kind of fight here is big states versus little states. Does everyone get the same amount of votes? Does everyone get the same amount of reps, or is it by population? And then kind of the final piece of this, some of you guys brought this up in class, what is in place to make sure this federal government is not going to become an oppressive government, the kind that they viewed Great Britain as? Is this federal government limited enough to prevent tyranny? And so before we get into this, just real quick, in thinking about kind of who is involved in this, slavery is going to be protected in the Constitution. It's in there that, they pass laws that it can't be banned after, before a certain day. And when you look at American Indians, they are also not included, along with slaves, into this idea of American citizenship. And so kind of later on, when we talk about things like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, Americans in a lot of ways are reimagining kind of who and what it means to be an American. American Indians not recognized as citizens, never imagine a place for them. Slaves not really recognized as citizens even when they're free, and so it's going to take a lot of change in order for this Constitution to kind of incorporate a lot more of the ideas that we consider core to America, and that phrase, we the people. So when they're making the Constitution, obviously you got to compromise, and so a couple of compromises that they came up with. The first thing was they decided to keep slavery legal, and that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person according to population. They also decided to have 2 houses, that's what bicameral means, in order to have both a House of Representatives based on population, and the Senate, a government body that everyone gets the same vote. They also separated kind of the states and the federal government's powers. The enumerated powers were given to the federal government and written down, and everything else that was left over, in theory, is going to go to the states. And we'll talk a lot about that idea later. We also have national supremacy now. In any conflict between the states and the federal government, it is the federal government that has the authority. And then the final kind of promise was to add a Bill of Rights to ensure individual liberties against the government. So the U.S. Constitution, when it was written, it was meant to kind of balance those debates. It's old, it's short, and it has those 6 big ideas that are all meant to kind of balance out all of our things. So real quick here, just a couple of basics. So in the Constitution, the federal government is supreme over the states. If you check out that ladder, it tells you kind of as you go higher which laws are more powerful and which will win in a conflict. We create 3 branches: legislative, executive, judicial. Enumerated powers. The federal government, it's written out in Articles 1 through 3 what the federal government is supposed to be doing. And then in Amendment 10, reserve powers, everything not in the Constitution goes to the states. Built into this Constitution was also a system of checks and balances. And in order to keep state power, they allowed for state legislatures, not the voters, the state government, to choose their senators, and the Electoral College, an indirect election of the president, was meant to give the states a lot of influence on this government. And so that was the original design. Federal government is all powerful in what it does, and the states are over here, all powerful in kind of what they do. So the Constitution is framework for arguments. We fight over federalism all the time. Every time a new issue comes up, whether it's the internet or whether it's cars or whatever it is, we always fight, should it be handled by a national government, a local government, a state government, or should it be handled by all the governments? For instance, something like gang violence. That involves both federal, state, and local officials working together. And so we argue, though, what is the role of the federal government versus the states on all these issues? We fight over our rights. How free should we really be? Where do our rights stop? At what point does order take precedence over this idea of unbridled freedom? We also debate democracy. Should the people really be ruling? The Constitution has a representation scheme. You don't really make a whole lot of decisions outside of who you elect. You vote, but that voting has always been restricted. Used to be a lot more restricted than now, but still, you have to be 18 years, you have to be a citizen, all those things. The Senate was not elected for a really long time. They actually had to amend the Constitution to have people vote for senators. And the president is still not directly elected. They're elected through a process called the Electoral College. And so we're talking about America as a democracy. The people who made this Constitution had a little bit of fear of democracy. That ultimately people, perhaps riled up by passions, needed kind of some structure. And so the idea was the states would have a lot of control over the federal government. And what we really call this kind of debate in the business, I guess, is the spirit of 76 versus the spirit of 87. 1776, the revolution, right? All about freedom, freedom from Great Britain, freedom from taxes, freedom from everything. Whereas by 1787, the world had changed and America had changed. And you started to see the weaknesses of too much freedom, not enough structure, and not enough government. And so when we talk about the transition between kind of the ideas that were America and what it became, it was a revolution fought for local control. But the Articles of Confederation didn't look after the national interest. And so we create a constitution that divides the two with some overlap that allows for these governments to solve their issues. The revolution was also fought over a fear over strong government. But too much liberty in all these states led to even further problem. So we created some guardrails, but it's a government of limited powers that only can basically exercise them within what is said in the Constitution. And so the framers, in here we have Hamilton and Madison, they really try to balance power, the compromise between strong government and individual rights. And they also tried very hard to compromise balancing kind of the national interests for all Americans versus local control and local issues. And arguably, these two things are still the most hotly debated topics in the Constitution. And so at the time in 1787, there was a big debate the same way there was now. Why set up a government in this way? And so, lacking cable television, lacking social media, these guys wrote articles in newspapers. The debate over ratification means the vote to approve the Constitution. The Feds and the anti-Feds, Publius, the pen name for the Federalists, versus Brutus, the pen name for the anti-Feds. And they had some debates that we still look at today to try to understand what was the point of all of this separation of powers. And so this year we're going to look at some Federalist papers. Federalist 10 is going to talk about factions. 46 is going to talk about federalism. 51 talks about limited government. Federalist number 70 actually answers the question, why should we have only one president? Federalist 76 talks about the Supreme Court. And we're also going to look at Brutus 1, anti-Feds, because he lays out this argument that the Federalists are simply wrong about everything. And so at this point, you guys can dig into your activity packet for Unit 1 and check out Federalists 51 and 46 to read the arguments that were spelled out by those that wrote the Constitution. Have a nice day.